growing calls for the global financial architecture to be reformed in order to reduce Africa's debt, and this in line with meeting the Sustainable Development Goals for a number of countries on the continent that find themselves in debt. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi is Executive Vice President of the African Center for Economic Transformation, and she joins us now to take a look at some of those countries that are indebted to world institutions and not just China, and what this means for the continent and her people. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with that. A little bit of context in terms of the countries that are indebted. To whom are they indebted and why?
So thank you very much. We are finding that countries have a very complex mix of people that organizations that they are indebted to. So we see that there is an increasing number of countries that have actually borrowed on the capital markets. So a number of countries went out and got bonds at very high interest rates. We've also seen a mix of countries which has domestic debt. So when they raised bonds, the middle class bought debt or lent the money. Invested in the bonds. We also have countries that, like every other country, you owe money to your service providers. And then we have the usual borrowers, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, the traditional borrowers. So it's a much more complex mix than we have seen in the past, and as you said earlier on, it's no longer just European countries that we are also borrowing from. We are also borrowing from China, Turkey, India. So the mix of borrowing is a lot more complicated than we saw, say, 20, 30 years ago.
Ma'am, how do you explain to a young person on the continent that says, with everything that the Democratic Republic of Congo has, with everything that the Republic of South Africa has, why are we finding ourselves in so much debt? Because that debt, for some people, it doesn't even translate to their lives. They do not see why these monies keep being borrowed.
So let's start with, why are we borrowing? Look, human beings, we all borrow, okay? We borrow to buy a house. We borrow to buy a car. It's an investment. We borrow to go to school. Borrowing in itself is not a bad thing. It's if you borrow at a sensible interest rate, okay? So if you go to the market and the interest rate is very high, eventually, you might find yourself in a situation where you are no longer able to repay your debt, which is where a number of countries find themselves in right now. But it's not a situation of always using the money wrongly. It's about the sources of income that countries have to repay their debt, and also where they have borrowed from and what that impact is. So just to break it down, firstly, we borrow money to build roads, infrastructure, etc., okay? But our main source of repaying these debts is a handful of commodities that we export. So when the global financial community has a crisis because there's a commodity bust, people are not buying our commodities, or the price of our commodities have gone down, the amount of money we actually have to repay our loans are limited. So the first thing is we need to diversify more. We need to move away from this reliance on a handful of commodities that we export as raw materials. And we need to diversify so that if there's a crisis in this sector, we still have money to repay our loans, which we have invested, hopefully wisely. That's the first thing. The second challenge that we have is that when we borrow, there is a bit of an unfair system going on. We borrow at much, much higher rates than other countries. So, for example, African countries go to the capital markets, and in 2021, for 10-year bonds, countries were paying between 5 and 16% coupon rates, compared to, say, 2 to 7% for a similar term bond in Europe, for European countries. So there is the system itself is not working in our favor. And then the third thing is, a lot of us know that interest rates have been pushed up in the US, in Europe, etc., because they are trying to manage inflation. Those decisions that are being made in Europe and North America are having a huge impact on us. So those decisions, for example, have increased our cost of borrowing to about 500% more of what it would have been if we had, say, borrowed concessional money from the World Bank. So there are lots of factors underpinning why we are where we are today.
Fair enough. I would like to pick up on a point on commodity prices, for instance, that you spoke of. Who sets the prices of commodities from Africa?
Well, it's set by global markets, but at the end of the day, the global markets are where you export your commodities, yeah? So we tend to export the bulk of our commodities to Europe and North America, and those prices are set there. We're beginning to see a bit of a pushback with a few African countries now pushing and stating that they are not going to sell some of their commodities below a certain price point. So let's see what happens there. But at the moment, it's set by global markets, which are predominantly driven by what we call the global north.
Okay. When we come back home and take a look at, you mentioned what the money is being used for, why we borrow, and you mentioned the construction of roads, for instance. When you take a look at the infrastructure makeup of a number of countries on this continent, some who gained independence some way, way ago, it's embarrassing, to say the least. And so hence the question of, when you speak to young people on the continent who are taking a look at this, who came into this continent and they're realizing that things are not moving or working quite the way that they should. You go to a number of airports and it's written in Mandarin. You have to ask someone here in Africa, you have to ask someone what that board reads or what that board says. Please help us make sense of what then needs to be done here at home. Do we have any ideas or any suggestions that we can throw about in terms of how to create our own financial architecture or infrastructure, while appreciating that we must play with the rest of the world? But what do we look like here at home?
Okay, so let me start with your point on the infrastructure. Look, I am the first to feel the pain of a lot of young people on the continent right now when we look at the infrastructure around us. But to be honest, the money we are borrowing is substantially lower than the trillions of dollars we need to actually build the infrastructure that we need on the continent. And I'm talking about roads, I'm talking about power, I'm talking about telecommunications. We need trillions, and we are borrowing hundreds of millions at the moment. So firstly, there's a deficit in the money that we have available to invest in this infrastructure. So that will always be a challenge. The second is that the little money we have is not always used effectively. All of you have seen the stop, start of infrastructure investment. This administration comes in, it starts a process. The next administration comes in, it doesn't finish it and starts another process. It costs us a lot of money because the road that hasn't finished here, or the power grid that wasn't finished here, by the time we go back to it 8 or 10 years later, it's deteriorated so much that we are starting from ground zero. So there's a lot of inefficiencies wasted that we need to course correct on ourselves, which brings us to the point of accountability. As citizens, we need to hold our governments to account for finishing what their predecessors have started, so that if a road is being built from north to south, we celebrate the completion of the road. We don't care who started, we don't care who finished. All we know is that the road has been completed. So there's a bit more on that on our side as well as citizens, because we jump on the political bandwagon, which doesn't necessarily work in our favor all the time. So that is the second point. The third point that I'd like to make is, look, as a continent, we could do so much better in diversifying our economies, okay? We can produce a lot more. If you look at what we do, we tend to export commodities, okay? Then we import a whole set of inputs, then produce a handful of completed products that then become very competitive and we can't compete with the global world. We've talked a lot about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We need to make it work in practice. We need to have division of labor, centers of excellence, centers of specialization, where we take advantage of the raw materials we are sitting on, add value where it's necessary, facilitate and support disruptors in the sectors. There's a lot of young disruptors in the sectors. We must build the ecosystem for them to grow. And then we diversify our economies. For me, when people say that we are sitting on a lot of raw materials and we're not using it properly, that actually isn't the thing that bothers me. The thing that bothers me is we are sitting on the world's youngest and fastest growing population. Okay? That's a major source of income and opportunity. And we are sitting on this in a rapidly aging world. And somehow we think it's acceptable that our young people are crossing dangerous waters to look for economic opportunities elsewhere. It's not. They should be looking here. And they should be choosing to go elsewhere because by making that choice to go elsewhere, they are exporting our skills there rather than running to look for economic opportunities.
Ma'am, thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, Executive Vice President of African Center for Economic Transformation.